The trial had ended, the courtroom emptied, and the buzz of whispered conversations had faded into memory. Weeks passed, but the echoes of that moment, the officer in cuffs, the jury's verdict, the judge's words, still lingered in the air, like smoke that refused to dissipate. Inside the Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C., Maya Ellis sat in her office on the top floor. Afternoon sunlight poured through wide windows, slanting across rows of bookshelves lined with law journals, case studies, and framed photographs from decades of service. Awards and commendations hung neatly on the wall, but Maya rarely looked at them. To her, they were reminders of duty, not trophies. Her eyes, however, were fixed on something far smaller and more personal, a plain white envelope resting on the center of her desk. It bore no return address. She had hesitated before opening it, half expecting another piece of anonymous hate mail, a cruel reality she had long grown used to as a black woman in power. But when she slid a letter opener along its edge and unfolded the paper within, her breath slowed. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, but unmistakably human. Dr. Ellis, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect to ever wear a badge again. But I need you to know that sitting in that courtroom changed me. For the first time, I saw myself clearly, not as a cop, not as a man with authority, but as someone who had become careless, angry, and cruel. You could have destroyed me with words, but you didn't. You let the law speak. I don't know who I was becoming, but I know who I never want to be again. I'm sorry. Charles Denton Maya read the letter twice. Her expression didn't shift. Not into a smile, not into forgiveness. But she sat quietly for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly between her fingers. Then, with deliberate care, she folded the letter and placed it into the top drawer of her desk. Not thrown away, not displayed, just kept. A record of a moment, not an answer. Her gaze moved from the drawer to the folder already waiting on her desk. A red stamp across the top read, Policy Review, Use of Force. This was never about one man, Maya reminded herself. Charles Denton was not the disease, only a symptom of a system that had allowed men like him to feel untouchable for far too long. And now it was her responsibility, not only as Deputy Attorney General, but as someone who had felt the sting of that slap herself, to make sure no one else endured it in silence. The meeting later that afternoon, Maya entered a glass-walled conference room where her internal reform team was already waiting. Young attorneys shuffled papers, analysts clicked through spreadsheets projected on the screen, and senior staff spoke in low tones until she arrived. The room stilled when she stepped in. Maya carried no entourage, no theatrical presence. She simply set her leather bag on the table, her Justice Department badge clipped neatly to the side, and opened the folder. We're rewriting the National Training Guidelines, she said without preamble. Her voice was calm but unyielding. I want new language on dignity during traffic stops, respect, transparency, oversight, and it needs to be written in a way that doesn't require someone to be a government official to feel safe on the road. The room was silent for a beat. Then one of the younger attorneys raised his hand cautiously. Ma'am, he asked, is this about what happened to you? Maya paused, meeting his eyes. Her voice softened, but it carried the weight of conviction. It's about what's happened to too many people for far too long. The room fell quiet again, not out of fear, but respect. From there, the meeting continued. Pages of proposals were debated, clauses rewritten, and oversight measures strengthened. It wasn't glamorous work. There were no cameras, no grand speeches, just lawyers, policies, and the unglamorous grind of real change. But Maya knew that this was where the future was shaped, not in the heat of a courtroom, but in the cool, deliberate lines of law and policy, the ripple of a letter, that night, back. In her office, Maya thought again about the letter from Denton. She hadn't decided yet what to make of it. Some would say it was nothing but an empty attempt at redemption, words written to soothe his own guilt rather than to atone for harm done. And yet, she couldn't ignore the small possibility it represented, that even one man, arrogant and abusive in uniform, could be shaken awake by consequence. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't healing, but it was proof of something Maya already believed. Justice doesn't just punish. It teaches, it transforms, and sometimes, in the right circumstances, it saves. Not him, she thought. Not completely. But maybe the next officer, who read about his fall. Maybe the next supervisor who thought about covering up misconduct. Maybe the next young recruit deciding what kind of cop to become. The ripple mattered. Quiet. Resolve weeks passed. The courtroom was quiet now. The verdict archived. The case officially closed. Officer Charles Denton was no longer a name on a badge. He was an inmate serving his sentence, stripped of authority, stripped of pension, stripped of the power he had once abused so casually. Maya's days filled with back-to-back meetings, reports and reform plans. The reforms weren't instant. They never were. But the gears of policy were turning, grinding forward. Training manuals were being rewritten, accountability standards tightened, oversight bodies strengthened, and always, at the center of those conversations, Maya carried a single reminder. This wasn't about her. It was about everyone who had ever been stopped, insulted, silenced, or struck and told to accept it. The slap still burned in her memory, but not as a wound, as fuel. The Cologne evening, as the late sun painted the sky in shades of amber, Maya sat alone in her office. The city stretched beyond her window, the Capitol dome gleaming in the distance. Her phone rested on the desk in front of her. She looked at the screen, at the call log. Just one name, one number, one call that had lasted less than 30 seconds, a call that had changed everything, not just for her, but for an entire system forced to reckon with itself. That call had not been made for power or privilege or personal protection. It had been made as a declaration. Justice will answer. She let the thought sit with her, heavy but steady. The cheek that had once stung was healed now, the skin smooth. But the memory was sharper than ever. It reminded her of how quickly power could turn cruel. But it also reminded her of something greater, that dignity, even bruised, could rise taller than force. The director, A. Knock, broke the silence. Her assistant peeked in. "Ma'am, the director is here for your meeting." Maya stood, sliding the phone into her bag beside her badge. Not as a shield, not as a weapon, but as a promise. When she entered the conference room, the director and several senior officials stood to greet her. "We're ready to begin," he said. Maya nodded. "Then let's do the work." And they did. Inside that room, words turned to actions. Policies changed. Training guidelines were rewritten. Oversight was strengthened. No headlines captured it. No crowds cheered it. But the system itself shifted inch by inch toward something fairer, stronger, truer. One woman, one call history, rarely remembers the quiet rooms, the paperwork, the meetings that stretch late into the night. It remembers the slap, the verdict, the speech. But Maya knew the truth. None of it would matter if the system didn't change in the quiet aftermath. She thought back to that day on the roadside. One officer, one moment, one slap. He had thought his power absolute. But then came one woman. One voice, one call, and everything had shifted. Because real justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply stands, unshaken, until the system itself has no choice but to move, and Maya Ellis, calm, steady, unyielding, the interrogation room was a box of gray walls, designed to strip away every comfort. A buzzing fluorescent light hung overhead, its hum almost as steady as the clock ticking on the wall. The metal table at the center bore scratches from years, of restless hands and nervous fingernails. In one of the two steel chairs sat Officer Charles Denton. His sunglasses were gone. The swagger he had carried on the roadside had evaporated. He sat slouched, his wrists locked in handcuffs, eyes lowered to the table. The sweat gathering at his temples glistened under the harsh light. He looked less like a figure of authority, and more like a man caught in a storm he couldn't control. The door opened with a slow, deliberate creak. Two federal agents entered, one tall, broad-shouldered, his presence filling the room, the other quieter, smaller, carrying a folder tucked neatly under his arm. They shut the door behind them, and the silence deepened. The tall agent leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. "Officer Denton," he said, his voice steady, "you know why you're here." Denton's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. His eyes remained on the scratches in the table as though he could will himself into the cold steel. The quiet agent opened the folder, sliding a stack of papers and photographs across the table. "We've reviewed your stops, body cam footage, citizen complaints. There's a pattern." Finally, Denton gave a short, dry laugh. "A few people didn't like getting a ticket. Now I'm in handcuffs. That's your pattern?" The tall agent leaned closer. "You didn't just write a ticket this time. You assaulted the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. That alone is enough to end your career." Denton's head snapped up, his voice suddenly defensive. "I didn't know who she was. She wasn't dressed like a federal official. She looked regular." The quiet agent raised an eyebrow. "By regular, you mean she looked like a black woman driving a nice car?" Denton's silence answered. "For him. You threw her ID on the ground," the agent continued. "You slapped her across the face. What gave you the right?" No response. The sweat on Denton's forehead now rolled down his cheek. "You've been protected for years," the tall agent said coldly. "Supervisors covering for you, complaints erased, excuses made. But this time, you chose the wrong person." "At last," Denton muttered. "I made a mistake." The tall agent's eyes hardened. "No, you made a choice." The agent stood. "You're being formally charged. Assault, misconduct under color of law, and civil rights violations." Denton stared at the table again. His lips parted, whispering almost to himself, "You're really going to ruin my life over one stop?" The tall agent didn't flinch. "You ruined your own life when you put your hand on an innocent woman, especially one who's spent her career fighting for the very justice you tried to trample." The door opened. Two officers stepped inside to escort him to holding. For the first time in years, Denton felt what it was like to be powerless. He walked out without resistance, the cuffs clinking softly in the silence. The trial. 2 weeks later, the courthouse buzzed with quiet tension. No reporters were allowed inside. This was not a spectacle for the media, but a solemn proceeding under the law. The marble halls echoed with the footsteps of attorneys and officers. In the courtroom itself, the atmosphere was heavy, the kind of silence that pressed against the chest. Maya Ellis sat near the front, her posture composed. She wore the same navy blue suit she had on the day of the stop. Her cheek had healed, but the memory had not faded. She folded her hands gently in her lap, her face unreadable. Across the room, Charles Denton sat beside his defense attorney. He looked smaller now, his skin pale, his shoulders slumped as though the badge had carried his spine, and now, without it, he was collapsing inward. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." Everyone stood as the judge entered, robes flowing, expression firm. "Please be seated," he said. He looked across the courtroom. "We are here today in the matter of the State versus Officer Charles Denton, charged with assault and misconduct under color of law." The prosecutor rose, a woman with sharp features and a steady voice. She stepped toward the jury, speaking with clarity. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about status. It is not about the power of one individual. It is about conduct and consequence. A woman was stopped without cause. She was humiliated and assaulted by the very person sworn to protect her. This is not just a legal failure, it is a moral one. When she returned to her table, Denton's defense attorney stood. He adjusted his glasses, his tone softer, almost pleading. Yes, my client made a mistake. But he had no idea who Dr. Ellis was. He panicked. He felt disrespected. He overreacted. Maya's jaw tightened. She had heard that word, panicked, too many times in her life, a flimsy excuse wrapped around acts of cruelty. The trial moved forward. Witnesses were called, the federal agents who had responded to Maya's call, the forensic expert who confirmed the red mark on her cheek was consistent with a handprint. And finally, Maya herself. She rose from her seat and walked to the stand. Her steps were steady, deliberate. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore her oath, and sat. The prosecutor approached. Dr. Ellis, can you tell the jury what went through your mind when the officer struck you? Maya turned her gaze toward the jurors. Her voice was even, unshaken. I thought of every person who had been treated as less because of who they were. I thought of how easy it is for power to forget its duty. And I thought, this cannot go unanswered. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply told the truth, and the silence in the courtroom was heavier than any shout. Fee, defense attorney tried to corner her. Why didn't you tell Officer Denton who you were? Wouldn't that have prevented the escalation? Maya's reply was calm but firm. Should I have to announce my title to be treated with dignity? Should any citizen? The courtroom went still. Even Denton kept his eyes fixed on the table. Days passed. Testimony after testimony built the case. By the time closing arguments arrived, the heart of it had already been heard. Justice, the jury understood, was not about titles. It was about choices. The verdict. The final day came. The judge entered once again. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Maya sat in the front row, her hands folded as always, her expression calm but alert. Denton sat stiffly beside his lawyer, his face pale, lips pressed tight. The judge turned. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood. Yes, Your Honor. In the matter of assault under color of law, we find the defendant Charles Denton guilty. A hush fell across the room. On the charge of official misconduct, guilty. Denton closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging. And on the charge of civil rights violations, guilty. The words landed like hammers. The judge nodded slowly. He fixed his gaze on Denton. Mr. Denton, you were entrusted with a badge, a symbol, of service and protection. You used it as a weapon. You targeted someone you assumed had no power, and now you face the consequences of your actions. Denton's lawyer rose, asking for leniency. He spoke of years of service, commendations, the dangers of policing, but the judge shook his head. Years of service mean nothing when you dishonor the very principles you swore to uphold. This court will not reward betrayal with mercy. The sentence came, a prison term, loss of pension, and permanent removal from law enforcement. Charles Denton would never again wear a badge, not in this state, not in any other. As officers approached to escort him away, Maya stood. For a brief moment, their eyes met. He said nothing. Neither did she. What passed between them was not vengeance, nor hatred. It was finality. The truth stood between them like a wall. This was justice, not because of her title, but because she had refused to remain silent. Aftermath. The courtroom slowly emptied. Outside, the sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Maya walked down them alone, her stride steady, her head high. An aide hurried to meet her. "Would you like a ride, ma'am?" Maya shook her head. "I'll drive myself." And she did. No cameras, no headlines, no crowds. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the system, this time, had worked. Not perfectly, not easily, but because someone had demanded in its design, a space built to impress as much as to inspire. Rows of polished wooden seats curved toward the stage, and soft light fell across velvet curtains that framed the podium. Delegates from across the nation filled the room, judges in their black robes, lawyers in their crisp suits, law students eager to catch every word, and policymakers whispering among themselves. This was not just another event on the calendar. It was the kind of gathering where reputations were made, where words had the power to ripple far beyond the walls of the hotel. Dr. Maya Ellis stood just behind the curtain, the weight of her title pressing against her shoulders. Deputy Attorney General of the United States. Months of preparation had gone into this keynote. Her staff had combed through statistics, case studies, and historic precedents to craft a polished speech. She had rehearsed it dozens of times, each line carefully designed to move the audience from recognition to applause. The final draft lay neatly inside a folder in her hand. But as she touched the edge of that folder, her fingers tightened. She thought of the slap on the roadside, the sting still faintly burning against her cheek. She thought of the arrogance in the officer's voice, the way he had tossed her license aside as though her identity was worthless. Most of all, she thought of how many others had lived that same humiliation without an escort of federal agents to arrive in time. The folder felt heavier than it should have. In that moment, Maya knew she would not open it. An aide approached and whispered, "They're ready for you." Maya nodded once. She stepped onto the stage, the applause rising as the audience stood to welcome her. She acknowledged them with a small smile, then placed the untouched folder on the podium. Her hands rested lightly on the wood as she looked, out at the sea of expectant faces. When the room finally settled into silence, she began. "I came here today with a prepared speech," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, but carried a quiet weight that drew every ear closer. It was filled with carefully chosen words about justice, equality, and the resilience of our legal system. But this morning, something happened that changed what I need to say to you. The audience shifted, curious. On my way here, I was stopped by a police officer. I had done nothing wrong. No traffic violation, no broken lights, nothing. But he pulled me over anyway. He demanded my license, and when I asked what the reason was, he slapped me across the face. Gasps rippled across the hall. A few heads turned in disbelief, others leaned forward as if to catch every syllable. Maya let the silence settle before she continued. I did not shout back. I did not resist. I made one phone call. Within minutes, federal agents arrived, and that officer was arrested. Justice moved quickly. For me. Her voice lowered slightly, more intimate now. But I stand here today knowing that if I were not who I am, if I did not hold this office, if I did not have this badge clipped to my bag, justice might never have come. For millions of others, there is no phone call that brings rescue. There is no convoy of black SUVs. There is only silence. The room was utterly still. Judges who had spent decades behind the bench leaned forward, their expressions heavy with the weight of her words. Law students stopped scribbling notes. Policymakers who usually listened with half an ear now sat upright, caught in the truth unfolding before them. This is why justice cannot be a privilege reserved for the powerful, Maya continued. It cannot depend on titles or positions. It must live in every courtroom, every police station, every roadside interaction. Because when justice is selective, it is not justice at all. It is favoritism dressed in uniform. She stepped slightly away from the podium, her voice gaining strength. We write laws, we defend constitutions, we swear oaths, but what good are any of these if, in practice, they do not protect the most vulnerable? The mother pulled over. On her way to work, the teenager walking home at night, the worker whose accent makes him a target. The families who carry fear each time red and blue lights flash in their rearview mirror. Maya paused, her eyes sweeping across the audience. Justice must not scream only when the powerful are harmed. It must stand quietly but firmly for every person who calls this nation home. The words struck deeper than any statistic could. She was no longer delivering a keynote. She was testifying. She took a breath and touched her cheek gently. "This mark," she said, "is not the story of my pain. It is the story of a system's failure. And yet, it is also the story of its potential, because the system acted eventually as it should. My challenge to you, to all of us, is this. How do we ensure it acts not because of who the victim is, but simply because it is right?" For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, one by one, people began to rise. The applause started quietly, then grew, rolling across the hall until it thundered like a storm. Maya did not bask in it. She stood steady, her eyes calm. This was not about recognition. It was about accountability. When the ovation finally subsided, she offered her closing words. "We have the power to shape a system where no one needs a title to be treated with dignity, where justice is not an exception, but an expectation. Let us not wait for another slap, another humiliation before we act. Let us stand now for everyone." She stepped back from the podium, the folder with her polished speech still untouched. What she had given instead was raw, unplanned, and profoundly real. And in that authenticity, her message carried more power than any scripted line could have. As Maya left the stage, she knew the summit would not remember her for the words inside the folder. They would remember the truth she had dared to speak, the truth born not from theory, but from lived experience on a quiet road just hours earlier. The officer's wrists were pulled behind his back, steel cuffs snapping shut with the unmistakable finality of consequence. His protests spilled into the air, half denial, half panic. But none of it mattered. The federal agents moved with a precision that allowed no debate. They had seen this before, the abuse of power, the arrogance of those who thought their badge gave them the right to humiliate. But this time, the victim wasn't nameless. This time, justice had answered instantly. Maya stood nearby, her cheek, still tender from the strike. She hadn't asked for special treatment, nor had she revealed her title in the moment. She had allowed the officer to expose himself, his actions speaking louder than any excuse he could offer afterward. Now the system itself was showing him who truly held authority. "Deputy Attorney General, we'll handle it from here," one of the lead agents assured her. His tone was clipped but respectful, his eyes steady. "Do you need medical assistance?" Maya shook her head. "I'm fine," she said softly, and she meant it. The sting of the slap lingered, but it had not shaken her composure. If anything, it had reinforced her resolve. The agents guided the disgraced officer toward one of the black SUVs. As he was pushed inside, his sunglasses slipped from his face, landing in the dust at Maya's feet. For a moment, she looked down at them, the symbol of his false authority lying discarded like her license had been minutes earlier. She didn't pick them up. Another agent retrieved her driver's license from the ground and handed it back with care, as though returning something sacred. "We'll file charges immediately," he said. "You won't have to lift a finger." Maya offered a nod of gratitude, but said nothing more. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, efficient, and absolute. The agents ensured her car was safe to drive, then escorted her back onto the road. 2 SUVs remained ahead of her, as a protective escort, while another trailed behind. The flashing lights of the officer's cruiser had vanished, replaced by the quiet hum of federal authority ensuring her passage. As the miles stretched ahead, Maya's thoughts drifted. She didn't replay the slap or the officer's insults. Those were already behind her. Instead, she reflected on the simplicity of the call she had made. Just one number, one sentence. Not a scream, not a plea. Just the calm invocation of power that came not from anger, but from position and principle. She understood the symbolism. For countless others, a similar call would have gone unanswered. Their pain would have dissolved into silence, their complaints buried under paperwork or ignored outright. Her privilege had shielded her where others had no armor. That truth weighed on her as much as it steadied her. The convoy carried her through the city streets, the summit drawing closer with each passing minute. Outside her windows, people went about their ordinary lives, unaware of the drama that had unfolded only a short distance away. A young mother pushed a stroller across the intersection. A man carried 2 cups of coffee, hurrying toward an office building. Students laughed as they crossed the street, their backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Life moved on, oblivious. But Maya carried with her a reminder of how quickly dignity could be stripped away and how urgently it must be defended. When they reached the Grand Hotel hosting the legal summit, the escort peeled away with quiet precision. Maya parked her car and stepped out, smoothing her suit. She caught her reflection in the glass doors. The faint mark on her cheek was still there, a small but undeniable reminder. She did not conceal it with makeup or attempt to hide it with her hair. It would remain, at least for now. Inside, the lobby buzzed with polished conversations and polite laughter. Lawyers, judges, scholars, and policymakers filled the space, shaking hands, exchanging business cards, debating theories of justice in rehearsed tones. They had no idea what had just happened on a lonely road outside the city. As Maya walked toward the conference hall, whispers spread. People turned to glance at her, some noting the quiet strength in her posture, others noticing the mark on her face but saying nothing. The program listed her as the keynote speaker. Expectations were high, but what they didn't know was that her speech, the one she had rehearsed for weeks, was already fading from her mind. She wasn't going to talk about abstract principles anymore. She wasn't going to quote statutes, cite precedents, or recite polished lines designed to inspire polite applause. Instead, she was going to tell them the truth. The raw, unvarnished truth about what had happened just an hour earlier. Because justice, she knew, was not a theory. It was not a speech. It was not an idea that lived in books and courtrooms alone. Justice was a woman on a quiet road, slapped across the face for daring to question authority, and a single phone call that reminded the system of its duty. As the conference doors opened and an aide guided her inside, Maya's hand brushed the badge clipped to her bag. Deputy Attorney General. A title, yes, but also a responsibility. Not to protect herself, but to ensure that no one else would have to rely on privilege just to be treated with dignity. Her steps were steady as she approached the stage. The audience, hushed, waiting for the carefully scripted words they expected. But Maya already knew she would give them something different. Something real. The slap still burned, but so did the lesson, and the nation was about to drove along the quiet highway with the same steady composure that had defined much of her life. The morning was clear, the kind of calm day that almost demanded reflection. Her black sedan moved smoothly across the asphalt, and the soft hum of the engine blended with the open silence of the road. She wore a navy blue suit, neat but unpretentious, paired with a leather bag that sat on the seat beside her. Clipped to the side of that bag was a badge that carried enormous weight. Deputy Attorney General of the United States. To the average passerby, she was simply a woman in a car heading to an event. To the legal world, she was the second highest law enforcement official in the country. But Maya did not measure herself by titles. Her strength came from something deeper, a lifetime of fighting for fairness in places where dignity was often stripped away. On that particular morning, she was heading to a prestigious legal summit. Months of preparation had gone into her speech, a carefully crafted message about equality, resilience, and justice. She rehearsed lines in her mind, steady and deliberate. each one meant to inspire others to believe in the law's ability to protect the powerless. Her hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, and her thoughts carried a quiet optimism. Nothing about the drive suggested trouble. No speeding, no broken lights, no reason to attract attention. Then the calm cracked. Flashes of red and blue erupted in her rearview mirror. The lights cut through the peaceful morning, demanding submission. Maya frowned, instinctively checking her speedometer and mirrors. Everything was in order. Yet the message was unmistakable. Pull over. With practiced calm, she guided her car to the side of the road and waited. The patrol car came to a stop behind her, and a tall white officer stepped out. His movements carried a swagger, the kind that told Maya he was not simply performing his duty, he was enjoying the display of authority. Dark sunglasses shielded his eyes, but his posture radiated arrogance. "License and registration," he barked without greeting, without courtesy. Maya's training as a lawyer and her years of experience in tense rooms steadied her response. She met his harsh tone with composure. "Of course, officer," she replied softly, reaching into her purse. Her hands did not tremble as she retrieved the documents. With a polite smile, she handed him her driver's license and registration. He took the items, glanced at them, and then raised an eyebrow. A smirk tugged at his lips. In an act that was both dismissive and insulting, he tossed her license to the ground. The small rectangle of plastic landed face up on the pavement, her identity literally discarded at his feet. Maya blinked once. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked. Her tone remained calm, even, but firm. "Step out of the car," he snapped, his voice louder, more commanding. She did not move immediately. "Can you please tell me what this is about?" she asked, still seated, her posture respectful but unwavering. That was when his hand came down. The slap cracked through the still air, sharp and brutal. The force turned her head. Pain flared across her cheek, hot and immediate, but Maya did not cry out. She did not raise her voice. She simply sat with her hand against her face, her eyes fixed on him. The officer leaned closer, his breath sharp with anger. "That's for talking back," he muttered. Maya did not flinch. The sting of the blow lingered, but so did her composure. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her purse again. This time it was not for her license. Her fingers closed around her phone. Without hesitation, without any tremor of fear, she dialed a single number. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and low. Just one sentence, nothing more. Then she ended the call and placed the phone in her lap. The officer sneered. "Who are you calling? Your husband?" His tone was mocking, dismissive. To him, she was just another woman who needed to be reminded of who held power on this road. But minutes later, the arrogance began to fade. The officer shifted his weight, looking down the road as several black SUVs appeared in the distance. No flashing sirens, no wailing alarms, just quiet authority rolling steadily toward them. The vehicles pulled to a stop around the scene, their doors opening in unison. Men and women in dark suits stepped out, their movements brisk and purposeful. The officer's smirk faltered. His hands hovered uncertainly near his holster. One tall agent walked directly to Maya's window. His voice was respectful, precise. "Deputy Attorney General Ellis," he said. "Are you all right?" Maya gave a small nod. Her silence said more than words could. The agent turned to the officer, his tone now sharp and commanding. "You just assaulted a top federal official. Remove your badge. Now." The officer froze, his mouth half open, disbelief flooding his face. For the first time that morning, he realized he had not been in control. The swagger drained from his posture, leaving only panic and the weight of his actions. Maya opened her door and stepped out, the mark still visible on her cheek. She stood tall, shoulders squared, her presence calm but powerful. She did not need to shout. She did not need to retaliate. Her very silence was a condemnation. Two agents closed in on the officer. "Face the car," one ordered. The officer stammered. "Wait, I didn't know who she was. She didn't say anything. I was just—" "Hands on the car," the agent repeated, firm and unyielding. Slowly, reluctantly, the officer complied. His gun, badge, and handcuffs were stripped from him. Another agent began to read his rights. The road that had been calm and quiet just moments before now carried a different kind of stillness, the weight of justice shifting into place. Maya said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence, her composure, and her single phone call had already changed everything.